Welcome back, everybody, and today we're going to be in Chapter 14, which is risk management. Employers have a heavy responsibility, not only to produce and to make the company profitable, but they also have a responsibility to provide for the safety of the worker. And that is a challenge, especially in today's world when we see all of the violence taking place. But there's more than just employee violence. There's maintaining a safe workplace. There are laws that protect certain workers. So today we're going to take a look at just a broad overview of it and our responsibility as Christians to be able to be good stewards of the people that God has entrusted us with to be able to manage in business. Okay, class, today we're going to take just a short look at Chapter 14, which is risk management and worker protection. And the reason why it's just a brief really overview is that it's looking at some of the same laws that we've already covered before. So we may have some new things, but I just want to bring out some highlights that you will need to keep in mind because they're going to be recurring issues that you're going to have to deal with in HR. Risk management. Part of your responsibility in HR is to maintain the safety of the workplace. Now, it's not your sole responsibility, but you as the HR professional will have to guide the organization in some of the decisions they need to make when it comes to workplace safety. So risk management is the responsibility to consider physical, human, and financial factors to protect the organization and individual interests. So what does that mean? Well, it's broken down here in 14.1. Some of the facets, the key facets that you're going to have to be concerned about contains your health, your safety, and your security. All three of those things are interrelated, interconnected, and interdependent many times. So if you're not secure, you're not going to be safe. And that could be from the people to the work environment itself and safety. If that's jeopardized, then health is going to be jeopardized. So you see just a broad pyramid from the bottom to the top, but they all are interrelated and interconnected and also independent to a certain degree, but they all influence each other. Now, let's break down those three dimensions. First of all, you have health, and that's the general state of physical, mental, and emotional well-being. Safety is the condition in which people's physical well-being is protected. Do you have a environment that is free from really physical threats? And it's not just from people. I was on the way to work, and I believe it was today, and I heard on the news where a person was working at a restaurant, and one of the employees died, and several of the customers got sick because of a cleaning chemical. I guess had gotten loose or spilled or whatever, but it actually killed an employee and also hurt or made sick several of the customers. So you have that obligation, and you can only imagine the lawsuits now that are going to result from that. Now, we don't want to trivialize it in terms of money or anything like that because lives were lost. So you want to make sure, though, that when it comes to the safety of the worker, the physical well-being is protected too. Security is the protection of employees and organization facilities from forces that may harm them. And this may be the issue now of workplace violence, security when it comes to the physical organization, the physical building. We need to make sure we have processes and operations in place so that if someone wants to do harm, that they'll be taken care of, that the employee will be protected. Also, too, you have the natural disasters that occur and so forth. So health, safety, and security, there are three simple terms, but they have far-reaching implications. Now let's take a look at some of the laws that HR professionals have to be cognizant of, and that's the Americans with Disabilities Act and safety issues. Employers try to return injured workers to work to reduce worker compensation costs, and when making accommodations for injured employees through restricted duty, essential job functions are undercut. So if they are coming back to work, they may be on restricted duty, so they can't work as they used to, at least for the time that they are considered disabled. And HR professionals understand ADA guidelines as they affect physical disabilities. It becomes difficult when mental illness is at issue. Now, if you remember, we've talked about ADA and how it requires us to make a reasonable accommodation to those with disabilities, and they've expanded that now to mental health. Well, how in the world do you make a reasonable accommodation to people who are struggling with mental illness? In fact, what we're seeing now, one of the arguments with gun control, is that the people are it's not the weapon itself, it's the people who have some type of mental problem. So that is opening up a whole new realm of issues for HR. But as HR professionals, you are going to have to be aware that you have to, under the law, do what you can to make a reasonable accommodation to people with disabilities, whether it's the injured coming back to work or whether it's those who suffer from infirmities that may or may not put your organization at risk. And you bear the responsibility for that. Now, child labor laws, I haven't heard much about child labor lately because really it's not to me, it's not a big issue now because of the legislation. You have the FLSA, which is the Fair Labor Standards Act, which set restrictions on work for younger workers. Those penalties can be very costly if you're caught working underage individuals. Work-related injuries of teenage workers is a significant issue. Are you putting them in danger? And then proper training of managers and employees, that's a critical consideration. Now on the next slide, you see some of the restrictions by age group. So age 18, let's look at the bottom here. The minimum age for employment in hazardous occupations, no longer subject to child labor provisions. So at 18, all bets are off. You can work them. But in 16 to 18 range, you can work unlimited hours in permissible jobs. And you may perform farm jobs, may perform any non-hazard jobs, and may not drive on public roads or perform duties of a delivery driver. So that would be a big one there. Ages 14 to 15. You can work a maximum of 3 hours a day up to 18 hours a week. You can work between the hours of 7 and 7 p.m. when school is in session. You can work a maximum of 8 hours up to 40 hours a week when school is not in session, for instance, the summertime, and can work until 9 p.m. when school is not in session. And then any age permitted to deliver newspapers, work as an entertainer, permitted to work for a family-based farm or others, cannot work in manufacturing or mining jobs regardless of ownership. So any age up to that point would apply, up to the age of 18 would apply to this one. So you might want to be aware of those restrictions and so forth so that you can make sure you don't violate them. Now, Occupational Safety and Health Act, which is OSHA. It was enacted to ensure that the health and safety of workers is protected, and I can be honest with you in saying that in the past we don't have the most stellar history of protecting the worker and providing for workplace safety. In the beginning, during the industrial age, families were required to go to work because they wouldn't pay a man enough to do enough or get paid enough to support their family. So mothers and even children had to come to work. The working conditions were harsh. There was no OSHA and there were no kind of regulations really to protect the workers. There was a textile factory out east, and it had 2 floors to it. The second floor was a place where seamstresses would come and work. In the morning, they would show up. They would go up to the second floor, sit at their sewing machine, and then the owner would lock the door. Now, these women, because they didn't have daycare back then, would bring their children. So it was harsh as it was. But one day, the building caught on fire and killed everyone up in the second floor. They were locked in. They couldn't go anywhere. So with that and some of the other atrocities that we've seen, kids working in coal mines and getting black lung, we started to take a different approach to how we look at the worker and workplace safety. So we see the OSHA administers the provisions of the law that guard or have purview over safety. And then you have the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, and they develop the safety standards by which OSHA operates. And then you have the Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission, and that reviews OSHA's actions. So let's take a look a little bit more about OSHA's enforcement actions. Now, OSHA has really 2 branches. They have the consulting branch, which they will come in and they will tell you areas that you need to improve upon. So they act more as a partner with the organization. But if you are in violation, they can come and shut you down, and that's the enforcement side of it. But OSHA enforces safety regulations. And since 2003, we see that incidences have declined, and employers must adhere to the general duty of employers is to provide safety and health work conditions. So from an OSHA standpoint, your job, Mr. Employer or Miss Employer, is to take care of the worker, their safety and their health. And then notifications and posters are required to be put up in public areas in the workplace so that they can be informed about OSHA's safety and health standards. So we see here that the compliance officers, they do come and inspect, and then really they can give you a citation for any violations. They can shut you down. They can do pretty much what they want to do if you're in violation of their standards. Now you see with citations and violations, there's imminent danger, and that means there's a reasonable certainty that the condition will cause death or serious physical harm if not corrected immediately. For instance, the Hard Rock Cafe that collapsed killed some people. So that would be a imminent danger that should have been recognized. Serious danger, a condition that could probably cause death or serious physical harm, and the employer should know of the condition. And then other than serious, the impact employees' health or safety, but probably would not cause death or serious harm. So you may be working in an area where it may be cluttered, and you may fall and break a leg or an arm or something like that, but it probably wouldn't cause death or harm enough to put you in the hospital or ICU. But there's still, serious consequences physically for that incident. Now, also, when it comes to citations and violations, you have de minimis, and conditions are not directly and immediately related to employee safety or health, and willful and repeated. And this is issued to employers that have been previously cited. There's some who don't regard the OSHA as someone that they should be listening to all the time. So others will try to get around the citations and so forth. But most common violations are related to fall protection, hazard communication, scaffolding, respiratory protection, and powered industrial trucks. And I had a church member who was working with a company. He was heating and refrigeration, and he had to get on one of those lift devices, a machine that I guess looks like a crane, and he got up to where he could work, and he backed up and leaned against the railing, and apparently the people who were in charge of that equipment forgot to pin the railing together properly, and he tumbled backwards. I think he fell about 20 feet, and it almost killed him. Now, as a result of that, he doesn't really have to work anymore. He bought a brand new house, which is an upscale house. He bought his wife and himself a brand new vehicle, a brand new swimming pool, not above ground, but the built-in pools, and he's living quite nicely now. So, folks, I can tell you it gets very expensive when you violate OSHA and someone gets injured as a result of your negligence or not willing to conform to OSHA's regulations. Now, security concerns at work. You've got workplace violence, security management, and then you also have employee screening and selection along with security personnel. So let's take a look at some of these. Security management is the violence prevention training. That's one dimension of it. Managers, HR staff members, supervisors, and employees should be trained on, first of all, how to recognize the signs of a potentially violent employee and what to do when violence occurs. Now, we have, here at Mid-America, I'm the fairly new director of institutional assessment, but I'm also the director of security. And I've taken steps to make sure that we are more secure here in the school and that we have a fast communication system and that we can recognize those potential employees or students who might be violent. And what do you do when violence occurs? Well, we have a protocol for all of that as well. So we have to make sure that we are vigilant, ever vigilant, in taking care of our employees through a continual assessment of our training and management and risk aversion programs. Now, workplace violence, you have different forms of it. Some of the warning signs and characteristics of potentially violent persons at work should be recognized by employees. If you don't have any of that training in place, you might want to talk to your supervisor and ask them to give you training on that. We live in an ever-increasing violent world, and as people become less sensitive to the sanctity of life and the value of life, life becomes trivial, and it's not much for a person to get upset and just say, you know, that's it, and they snap, and you see all types of havoc being unleashed. But there's other types of violence. Workplace incivility. That's rude behavior that offends other employees. It could be just the way that you talk or the way that you act could be offensive. Bullying is behavior that the victim perceives as oppressive, humiliating, threatening, or infringing that occurs over an extended time. So none of this stuff is acceptable. And there is a provision that we have under the law that's called harassment. There's sexual harassment, but there's also what we call creating a hostile work environment. And anybody who feels like they're being threatened, anybody who feels like they are in danger, or they are being, as we see here, humiliated or whatever, that's creating a hostile work environment. And it's our responsibility, whether you think it's that way or not, it's our responsibility to protect these employees, because once the lawsuit is filed, there is no getting it back. The person will file it, and chances are they'll win. Now, security audits. It's just a review of your organization's security procedures. You can do a security audit controlling physical access to the facilities of the organization. We have here at Mid-America a key card system. And if you don't have a card, you don't have access to anything other than the main doors, and even that is locked after a certain time. Controlling access to HR data. You want to make sure no one can get to your HR personnel files. Screening job applicants, and that's really at the first line of defense. And when I teach staffing, I try to impart upon them that whatever you hire is what you own at that time. They're yours, for the good or for the bad. So if we do a comprehensive screening and background check, then chances are we're going to find any of those who may be potential threats and may be able to take, and as a result, take the proper action. Even in churches today, you cannot assume that people are living godly lives. I have had, through security checks of my church personnel, found people who have applied for positions and discovered that they have records. I had one person, he and his wife wanted to work with our children and our children's ministry. And when we did the check, he didn't think we would go as far reaching as we always do. But we found out that while he was living in Texas, he was arrested for child pornography. So these little things, it will hurt you if you don't do due diligence. So screen your applicants and provide training for security personnel. And that's important. Many times in the past, when organizations have had to experience violence in the workplace, it could have been curtailed if the people there who are providing security would have been properly trained. So invest in that. Now, workplace violence is the last one we'll look at today, and that's to develop policies and practices to prevent and respond to workplace violence. Train managers, especially give them examples. Sometimes people don't know that violence is occurring. They overlook it or they don't think about it, but they need to be sensitive to anything that might even remotely resemble something that could escalate into something more destructive. Create a violence response team. And these are individuals who will come in who are trained to be able to handle that within your organization. And then develop post-violence response plans. What do you do after the fact? How do you cope? How do you counsel? How do you get back to business as usual? So these are some of the recommendations when you're dealing with workplace violence. Unfortunately, it's a very real reality today, even in our churches. We have people who they're sick. Their way of thinking has been tainted by sin, and many of them will resort to violence. Churches, pastors, congregations aren't excluded today. So your organization and your church needs to develop a way to deal with, recognize workplace violence when it occurs. Now, this is going to be it for this week. Have a good weekend, and I will continue on next week with Chapter 15.
Today, businesses are more in tune and have to be more aligned with what's going on in the world today. We have to be aware not only of what's going on legally, as legislation is passed that is more demanding of employers to provide a safer workplace, but we also have to be aware of our surroundings and the people that we hire from the very beginning, from the hiring all the way through the end of that person's tenure there at whatever job they're at. It's our responsibility to make sure that they are safe and that they are relatively safe themselves as far as being dangerous or violent towards other workers. So today you got an overview of this, and it's going to expand. It's not going to decrease. So I hope with this chapter you can take away some of the key features of the laws that are present that we have to maintain and the obligation that we have as business owners, as business leaders, not only in the professional world, but as Christian business leaders and in our churches, because churches are starting to experience what the world is experiencing right now. But whether it's business or church, we are mandated by God to be examples. And doing that makes sure that we have a attitude of care and concern for our workers and the environment that they work in. Well, have a good weekend, and we'll start back next week with Chapter 15.